Howdy, this lecture is for the course INST 222. Our topic is leadership. It comes from our text, Diversity Consciousness. Upon completion of this chapter, you will be able to comprehend the following learning outcomes. At your leisure, please take a look at them. On your screen is an image of the Orpheus Orchestra. For the last 30 years, the Orpheus Orchestra has rehearsed, performed, and recorded without a conductor. Members select a small group for each piece of music to work out the details and then present their ideas to the entire orchestra. The entire orchestra refines the final product, rehearsing a piece and checking the sound. At some time, every member is expected to be a leader. So this is a classic example of distributive leadership, an opportunity in which every member of the orchestra has an opportunity to be a leader. What is leadership? Well, our author says that leadership is the process by which people inspire, influence, and empower others to achieve a common goal. Our author goes on to say that leaders can exert a positive or negative influence. The author tells us that there are three key features that we need to understand about leadership. First of all, leadership is a process, meaning it reflects what someone is doing rather than his or her own position. Leadership is interactive, that is, it focuses on the relationship between the leader and those being influenced. The third key is that leadership is situational, meaning it can not be analyzed apart from the context in which it occurs. Our author tells us that in the United States, organizations are becoming flatter. That means we are losing the hierarchy that often sort of defines large organizations. And these hierarchies are being replaced with self-managed teams. For example, the Orpheus Orchestra. And so what you have are relatively small groups of employees who function on their own and are given significant responsibility for planning, organizing, and decision making. They assume more of the workload, and there are more opportunities for all to be able to lead. When you look at what leadership skills are most important today, the Center for Creative Leadership has gathered some data for us to take a look at. And when you take a look at the image on our screen, we see four key skills, and the lowest ranked is organizational skills. Next is demonstrated knowledge or technical skills. And followed as number two is commitment. And the number one skill that's considered most important is interpersonal skills, the ability to be open and to relate to others and to be able to build relationships with others. And that's what great leaders do. Now, the author now brings us to a very interesting take on leadership and introduces us to a term known as diversity conscious leadership. Our author, Butcher, refers to this term as the process by which people influence and empower others, but they go a little bit further. And they do this by recognizing, understanding, and adjusting to diversity in all of its forms. So diversity conscious leaders behave a little bit differently. They are competent thinkers and actors in a variety of worlds. They do not evaluate actions of others based on what they would do. They don't expect others to behave the way that they would behave. So this is known as mirror imaging, when you expect others to do, act, say exactly as you behave. So diversity conscious leaders, they don't engage in that kind of act, this act known as mirror imaging. And also, diversity conscious leaders do not assume similarities or differences. And so what this means is that they don't assume that everyone may act a particular way or or that they are necessarily strangely different from others. Now, there are many myths about leaders and diversity leaders as well. And the author introduces us to this idea about leaders. And the first myth is that uh, diversity conscious leaders or just average leaders are naturally people persons. And the author says, in reality, there is nothing natural about the ability to relate to others effectively. As with any skill, people develop and improve their competencies in this area. So, much like developing a muscle that you have to work on, the same can be said in terms of relating to others. You just don't naturally learn how to get along with other people. You have to put in some real effort. The second myth about leaders is that these are people who have an extremely rare ability. And our author says this is not the case. Everyone has the potential to be a diversity conscious leader. If we move down to myth number 5, the fifth myth says that leaders and diversity conscious leaders are able to persuade and control people in spite of their differences. And our author says this is a myth, but in reality, diversity conscious leadership is not as much about the exercise of power. It's more about the empowerment of others. As we move on, our author goes into some key skills of a diversity conscious leader. And the first one is about adapting. Our author says that diversity conscious leaders do not necessarily gravitate to what is comfortable or familiar. Rather, they seek to expand the repertoire of leadership styles and develop their ability to seamlessly shift styles depending on the cultural context. So, given the dynamics of a group, they may choose to coach and collaborate with others or avoid emotional bonds and adopt a more authoritative posture. So, we see that diversity conscious leaders are able to weave in between different types of leadership styles. The author goes on to say another key skill is thinking and communicating inclusively. Our author says, in order to think and communicate inclusively, diversity conscious leaders are students of people and their interrelationships. These leaders are aware of the danger of only internalizing information that reinforces their own beliefs and values while ignoring or rationalizing away information that does not fit their preconceived ideas or judgments or assumptions about other people. The next key skill of a diversity conscious leader is their ability to assess and monitor. Our author goes on to say that what are the ways in which my cultural background, gender, religion, and race frame my thinking and influence my actions? Well, this is a big question on the minds of diversity conscious leaders. They're always doing that kind of introspection and self-reflection that is necessary for leaders to grow. They don't mind doing the hard work of self-monitoring. And self-monitoring is the ability to use interpersonal cues to understand better one's own behavior and its effects on others. Our author goes on to tell us that there are 4 building blocks of diversity conscious leaders. And these building blocks help in the kinds of self-assessment that one needs to do in order to know if you're growing in one area, if you have a strength or a weakness in a particular area. There are all kinds of activities that one can engage in, a kind of checklist, if you will, to see if you can identify in a self-monitoring kind of way if you have the skills, the understanding, the commitment, and the awareness to be a diversity conscious leader. At your leisure, take a look at the activity on page 225 and 226 and see where you stand on these 4 building blocks. As we move on into the reading, our author tells us that there are many theories about leadership, and he tells us that traditionally so-called trait theories of leadership were built on the premise that certain people are born leaders. And according to these theories, were distinguished by certain traits, physiological, psychological, and intellectual traits that set them apart from other people. We know now in the 21st century that a lot of these ideas about these naturally born leaders doesn't hold a lot of water. The author goes on to tell us about behavioral theories of leadership, and these shifted the conversation away from the ideas of traits and more towards the idea of looking at the behaviors of potential leaders. And two major research efforts associated with this school of thought took place during the mid 1900s at the Ohio State University and the University of Michigan. And researchers identified two dimensions of leadership behavior that influence work performance. Leaders who were production or task oriented, and those who were more people oriented. The author goes on to tell us that there are other dimensions of leadership theories that have popped up as well. And so, in a lot of the contemporary discussions, we've learned that the first dimension is focused on this conversation about instrumental leaders, and these are task-oriented leaders, and this would be that kind of dimension that would come out of a lot of behavioral theories. And so, this type of leader, they tend to focus more on the task at hand and less on how group members get along. Now, people oriented or expressive leaders take a different approach. Their primary concern is the well being of group members and their ability to work as a unit. Although each of these behaviors was found to have certain benefits, subsequent research found that effective leaders often combine a concern for people and a concern for performance. Our author goes on to tell us that another dimension of leadership has arisen as well, and that is known as situational leadership theory. And this theory suggests that different leadership styles are more or less effective in different situations. Leadership styles, which refer to the way we influence others, are numerous and varied. And so the author shares three from our text that is very rampant in the research on leadership. And the first style is authoritative. And someone who is an authoritarian will make all or most of the decisions and keep power very close to themselves. They are very directive in the way that they speak. Their interactions with their followership may be more assertive. They're not really interested in collaboration, and they will do more dictating than collaborating. The next type of leadership style is a democratic style of a leader. And they're interested in sharing power, and they encourage group discussion and decision making. So this is a type of leader, for example, that will call committees and encourage people to socialize and collaborate and take votes and really sort of try to understand how your peers feel about ideas and tasks. And the third type of leader is a laissez-faire leader. And this type of leader is minimally involved, and they will leave the decision making to others and encourage group members to make their own decisions. So they like to step back and take more of a quiet role in terms of directing others, and will let their followership be in charge of leadership. Our author tells us that situational leaders refer to individuals who adapt their leadership style depending on the circumstance. So, what this tells us is that sometimes you may need to be laissez faire when you have very competent or capable people, but you may need to be more of an authority when folks lack the technical skills to step up to the job. When you know that there needs to be a balance and that there needs to be a task and a people oriented focus, a democratic approach may be more useful. So it is the smart leader who knows how to weave back and forth between and among the different leadership styles. So as we move on, our author introduces us to this idea of taking a look at leadership in terms of the cultural context in which it might occur. And he introduces us to Hofstede's research, and Hofstede is a researcher primarily in the business world, and his research has really influenced the way we think about leadership in the corporate and business setting. And so he is suggesting that we look at these different dimensions of culture to give us insight into who people are and how they behave, and it helps us to relate to them a bit better. Now, the first dimension of Hofstede's sixth dimension is this value orientation as it relates to relationships. And he says that some countries have a more individualistic idea or value system when it comes to reliance, whether you're talking about reliance on yourself, which is the individualistic approach, or doing activities or, or or coming together on behalf of the group, and that is more of a collectivist approach. And our author says that with the research that Hofstede has undertaken a few decades ago, there is a lot of data that suggests that countries like the Netherlands and the United States are more highly individualistic countries. We believe in individuals doing things on their own. For example, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. And there are countries that are more collectivist in the way that they look at this value of reliance. And so we have countries like Japan and Pakistan who have a more collectivist orientation. Another of the Hofstede's dimension has to do with power distance and respect. Our author says in large power distance cultures, significant inequalities among people are both accepted and expected. So you might find in countries that have a large power distance, a lot of monarchies or a big sense of royalty, or there's this real great divide between the classes that is understood and accepted. But in small power distance cultures, these countries play down the importance of inequalities in power and wealth as much as possible. So, for example, the United States would be a small power distance. We don't believe in having these strict rules about the differences between people and power and class. Even though we may have these differences, we don't play them up. We don't believe that someone who is wealthy has more of rights or privileges in our country than someone who does not. But there are countries that believe that wealth equals might, and countries like Singapore or the Philippines. Another cultural dimension by Hofstede is this idea of strong versus weak uncertainty avoidance. Our author says in societies characterized by strong uncertainty avoidance, risk and uncertainty are avoided if at all possible, and absolute truths are embraced. So these are countries that don't believe in dealing with the gray areas. Things are either right or wrong, and there is no ambiguity. But people in weak uncertainty avoidance societies tend to avoid absolute truths and do not feel nearly as threatened by behavior and opinions different from their own. So they're more open to diverse perspectives and ways of doing things. They don't lack they lack the kind of uniformity that you might see in other countries. So a country like Ireland and Great Britain may be less strict in how they believe everyone should behave as opposed to a country like Turkey and Japan. Another dimension by Hofstede is the dimension of masculine versus feminine, and that Hofstede refers to masculine cultures as those that sharply delineate gender roles and attach more importance to roles associated with males, such as assertiveness and independence. Now, feminine cultures, on the other hand, as defined by Hofstede, are those that distinguish among gender roles to a lesser degree and attach more importance to roles associated with females, such as relationship oriented activities and interpersonal sensitivity. So you see that Sweden on our screen is more of a strong feminine culture, lots of importance placed on relationships and people, as opposed to a country like Japan, where men may be given the more dominant roles in society. Now, I want you all to think about where the U.S. would probably land on Hofstede's chart. It's always a good idea for you to take some time to reflect on where you would stand in terms of your cultural values. Are you you do come from a home where there was a large or small power distance? Do you come from a home that was more collectivist thinking or individualistic? These are ideas that you need to think about, whether you're going to be an engineer or you're going to be a teacher, because what you value often influences how you behave, and it will have a huge impact on the work that you do and how you interact with others as well. Our author then goes on to tell us that Hofstede's model focuses us to this idea of looking at leadership a little bit more differently. It really should expand our view on leadership. And our author says that traditionally, leadership has been evaluated from a narrow ethnocentric perspective. Theories on leadership usually reflect a micro level orientation, and that is a viewpoint that focuses on interaction among individuals in a specific setting. But a macro level orientation focuses on large scale patterns of behavior in organizations, societies, and the world as a whole. By viewing leadership from a broader perspective, Hofstede shows the importance of evaluating leadership in a cultural and global context. He goes on to tell us that if we are not prepared to make a kind of adjustment we need in terms of looking at our relationships from a cultural orientation, the result could very well be culture shock, feelings of disorientation and stress due to experiencing an unfamiliar cultural environment. Our author goes on to tell us that the skills that we have today will look very different from the skills that will be important in the future. You know, the skills from 2002, what were considered most needed and necessary, you know, this idea of being competitive and staying the course and being independent decision makers. Well, leaders of the future, we have to learn how to work in a very globalized world. We have to be interdependent decision makers. We have to be more collaborative in our dealings with others, and we have to learn how to adapt and to be flexible. Effective leaders are open to change based on input and feedback from the team. That's why it's so good to, you know, be able to sound off with members of a team, to be a part of something bigger than yourself. Effective leaders empower others. Effective leaders have a broad knowledge and awareness of diversity issues. And effective leaders, they don't just talk, but they walk the talk. And these are people who don't naturally know how to get along with people who are different from themselves, but they figure it out along the way for sure, and they work at it. It's much like trying to work on any other skill. One must work on it constantly. Leadership development is really important, and we have to, our author says, break away from these cookie cutter approaches and methods we've used in the past. Everyone who is looking at issues of leadership, we are now convinced that the ideas and approaches that we have used in the past in terms of leadership will require that we do something a bit different because the world is changing. We live in a multicultural nation and a multicultural world, and we will be interacting with people all around the world in many different environments, people who have different value systems, different perspectives, and an effective leader is someone who knows how to adapt to this type of change. This is a quote I'd like to share with you all, and I want to end on this quote. And here we are. It says, "The job of today's leader is to create space for other people, a space in which people can generate new and different ideas, a space where seemingly disparate departments and people in the organization come together and have a meaningful conversation, a space in which people can be more effective, more agile, and more prepared to respond to complex challenges." Just wanted to share that with you. Thanks and gig 'em.